Welcome to the Proactive Security Podcast with Mike Hodges and Brine Hamilton. This podcast is dedicated to discussing violence prevention in healthcare. We want to inform, equip, and empower healthcare security leaders to prevent violence before it happens. And now, here's your hosts, Mike and Brine.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brine.
And this is the Proactive Security Podcast, episode 15. That's 15 for everybody keeping score at home. We are excited today. We've got a very special guest with us, Rick Smith, who is the CEO and founder of Axon, formerly known as Taser, for some of you in the profession that are familiar with it that way. He has joined us as a guest today. He's committed to disrupting the public safety industry with technology that helps us create safer communities and helps us move towards eliminating the need for lethal force. And I'm really excited for us to be able to have a conversation about that. I'll give you a little background on Rick. He holds a degree in neuroscience from Harvard, cum laude. I've been told that might be difficult to achieve. He has 2 master's degrees, one in international finance from the University of Leuven in Belgium. Don't hold me to that pronunciation. And a master's in business administration from the University of Chicago. He's also a co-winner of the Ernst & Young Award for Entrepreneur of the Year and was cited on a list of most admired CEOs by the Phoenix Business Journal. Additionally, Rick is the author of The End of Killing: How Our Newest Technologies Can Solve Humanity's Oldest Problem. Rick, we are excited to have you, man. Thank you for participating in the Proactive Security Podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
I'll start the conversation off and we'll refer back to your book, The End of Killing. Now, we want to unpack something there, and it's essentially your view. You have a pretty unique view of the future and how technology is going to reduce our reliance on the use of lethal force. Now, can you unpack that thought a little bit for us?
Yeah. So in the modern world we live in, the lethal use of lethal force is not for the purpose of killing people. It is only for the purpose of stopping a threat. And that's something that, like most people, if you don't really know much about modern policing or security or stop to think about it, you just think, well, police shoot to kill, or private citizens. No, it is illegal. It is not legal to shoot for the intention of killing someone, but you can use lethal force when it is the only way you can effectively protect yourself. And what that means is we have a technology problem that we've not yet solved, and that is, how do we bring about weapons that could protect us as reliably as a gun that could stop somebody right here, right now, without killing them. And we can see it in science fiction, much like many inventions start in our imagination first. We see them in fictional works, and then they become real. And that's Captain Kirk's phaser from Star Trek, right? If you're watching Star Trek and he pulled out a 9mm and blew a hole in a Klingon, you'd be like, whoa, what's going on? Like that would seem bizarre in this future where they've got better tech. And I think it's actually a bit bizarre today. I mean, we were using bullets to fight the British on the fields of New England like 250 years ago, when medicine was a bottle of whiskey and a saw, and transportation was riding in a horseback. All these other industries have come so far. And for me, the insight that sort of inspired me to start this company and this career was this idea that personal safety and protection is a basic human need. And yet, it's a core sector that we've not really seen technology come to the party yet. We're still using medieval killing tools to protect ourselves. And I think once a company, and I hope it's us or some other tech provider, gets it right, then very quickly we're going to see the world go, well, wait a minute, why do we need to kill people anymore? We've got other ways of doing what we need to do. If somebody's doing something really dangerous, let's put them down and take them to jail and sort it out. And not have to, execute them there on the spot.
I think that's a fascinating philosophy, and I was really excited to understand that thought process better when I read your book. I think in kind of the microcosm of healthcare, which is Brine and I's bread and butter when it comes to our aspects of the security industry. We are committed to violence mitigation and protection, right? The healthcare security industries, or the healthcare industry in general, is the most violent industry in the United States. And so we deal with violence on a regular basis, but in a lot of cases, the violence that we see is perpetrated by our patients. So we're really stuck in this, kind of competing ideologies where we as healthcare security professionals are seeking to protect, to stop the threat, as you mentioned, but also, we're committed to treating our patients as healthcare professionals to do no harm, as we say in the healthcare industry. And so I believe your ideology has tremendous value for us as we seek to protect our organizations. What I'm interested in is, I hear every day on some level from some person in and around security that we have to have guns to keep people safe. And I'm a former soldier. I was in the Army for a long time. I've certainly touched guns and been around guns. Not an anti-gun guy in any way, shape, or form, but I struggle with this thought process that we need guns to keep people safe. And so, can you share with me your thoughts on how you've seen technology employed that helps us overcome that mentality?
I actually agree that today there are many situations where we do need guns to keep people safe. I'm challenging that premise will be true for long if we work at it. It's going to take some time. I've set a goal for my organization to create a technology that outperforms the pistol by 2030. So I hope it's not true for much longer. But ultimately, historically, weapons or security technology has worked through this sort of simple, brutal math that you got to hurt the other guy before he hurts you. And the more effective a weapon is, that means the more people it could hurt or kill. Correlation between effectiveness and danger, so to speak. You're hitting somebody with a fist is not as effective as hitting them with a club, is not as effective as hitting them with a bullet, because you're just causing more and more injury. And where I think this begins to change is we now understand the human body much better than we did 500 years ago, right? We can put anesthesia into you to put you to sleep. And I just had 2 teeth replaced this morning, right? Pretty amazing technology. They can do that where you don't feel it, or they can put a human being all the way out. Well, it turns out electricity also has some real power within the body, and that's how we control all of our neurological movements. All of our muscular movements are controlled by a combination of electricity and chemistry. Now, there are some chemical weapons. Unfortunately, they're really hard to calibrate to use safely. The Russians tried to use in the theater rescue, they tried to use some inhalants to basically knock everybody out. And the dosing is just really difficult to do it safely. But with electricity, we actually have a very high margin between the effective dose and the lethal dose, such that we can effectively incapacitate someone, we can paralyze their body, and yet bring them back with very little risk of injury, about 3 injuries per 1,000. So I do think it is still true today that in many situations, especially in a country that, look, we're awash in guns, whether you love them or not, our police and our public security and our hospitals have to deal with people that are coming in armed and angry. Now, I think responding with a gun carries its own risks, right? Now you've got a bullet flying in a medical facility, pretty hard to control where those end up. So I do believe, we're getting pretty close to where we could be able to engage somebody with something that's going to put them down immediately, and yet get rid of all these external risks of if you hit the wrong person or if the weapon gets compromised, right? Anytime you bring a lethal weapon into an area, have a lethal weapon there. This is one of the arguments against putting guns in the cockpit of airliners after 9/11, was the concern, well, it's great if the pilot's got the gun, but once the gun's there, what if, a terrorist cell figures out how to sort of get access to the weapon? We've now got a weapon past security and into the aircraft that somebody could gain hold of. So it is a important issue to solve. And I don't want to say we're there yet, but at least we're having the conversation of, okay, what would it take for us to be able to say the gun is no longer needed in these environments?
No, great summary of that there. Now, in terms of the tools like the Taser itself, and I'm thinking as a Canadian here, it's not even a tool that a lot of our police officers have access to. So, definitely a no-go in healthcare security environment. But even as I speak with my peers in the US, I feel like it's a tool that has a lot of resistance within the healthcare environment. I guess what I'll ask is, what has your experience been in terms of healthcare, especially with the changing the changing landscape with the increases in violence in healthcare facilities. Have you had that kind of similar experience that people, or there's some kind of resistance towards using a taser in a healthcare environment?
I would say it's declining significantly from where it was 10 years ago. And by the way, in Canada, it used to be there were no tasers, but now we're pretty widely used. You know, every officer in Toronto and the OPP has them widely deployed, and the RCMP and others. I think this is the phenomenon of the new versus the now. You know, things that are new make us uneasy, and they tend to get a lot of negative attention in the news media or social media. And when taser weapons were relatively new to policing in the years sort of 2000 to 2005, we saw an explosion in negative publicity around, you know, how dangerous it is. I mean, in Canada in 2007, I would say was the year that we really saw a lot of negative publicity. And one great example I'll use is self-driving cars. You know, in 2000, I think it was 2018, a self-driving Uber in Tempe, Arizona, my home state, hit and killed a pedestrian. And that made news headlines around the world. Can you name another traffic accident in the past 5 years? I mean, it's kind of hard to name one that, I can't think of another one that got that level of notoriety. And yet every year worldwide, 1 million people are killed in car accidents. And yet even today, the tone of the conversation is, oh, these self-driving cars, they're too dangerous, they're going to kill people. And we're killing 1 million of each other right now. And so what that does, it really sets up that newer technologies have to both far exceed the safety parameters of what we accept today. And even then, they're going to have to go through a sort of a public vetting cycle where people need to kind of learn about it and begin to accept it. I think in law enforcement, we're there now. Tasers are widely accepted as ubiquitous law enforcement equipment. And because of that, we're now starting to see a lot more deployment in private security and in healthcare, where, you know, once you get into the brass tacks conversation, look, if we have to have a weapon to protect somebody in an ER where you're going to have potentially violent, angry, intoxicated people showing up, you then have to look at what's the menu of choices. Well, we can use a chemical spray. Probably some drawbacks to deploying a chemical airborne spray in a hospital environment where you could contaminate equipment, get up in air ducts, et cetera. You can go to blunt force implements, and we know how injurious those are. You can go to lethal force, or you can look at these electrical weapons and now have a really well understood safety profile. So I think it's just mostly about public acceptance, because once we get to the discussion of facts and science, it becomes really pretty obvious that we're 2 orders of magnitude less dangerous than any other option out there today. Not to just sell our technology, but I think in general, we need to look as critically at our current practices as we do at new technologies.
I think, you know, I like to take a moment in the conversation just to point out how Canada is always trailing behind the United States. I feel like that's appropriate at this point there, Brine. But as we move on in the conversation, I think it's interesting, you know, across the spectrum of some of Axon technologies, you know, it certainly, I've seen resistance in the implementation of those, you know, the Taser device specifically, but also body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras are something that we've chose to use in my organization, along with the Taser device. And I think, you know, new technology allows us to extend the capacity and the capability of the officers we deploy. So, you know, if we want to put forward an effective and capable officer, then we have to equip them with effective and capable tools. You know, I see tremendous value in both tools. And the Taser, as you mentioned, it's a very well documented, safe, effective, you know, weapon that prevents us from having to make a jump to something like a firearm, which we know is going to have significant impacts. No matter how it's used, you put a gun on the stage, somebody's going to use it. When somebody uses it, it has tremendous ramifications. But I think, you know, also with technologies like your body-worn cameras, they present not only good documentation opportunities, but tremendous de-escalation value. Can you explain how maybe the body-worn camera technology has really revolutionized policing, but also the potential benefits for healthcare security forces?
Yeah, well, anytime we think about an enterprise, you know, an organization that includes multiple people, and you then think about, you know, if you're going to have a security function, that becomes one of your more critical functions, because by definition, that's not just some administrative function. That is going to be dealing with life, death, injury, mitigating threats, potentially hurting people intentionally when you have to use force on them, particularly lethal force. And so I think in that context, the management tools you need to do it effectively are also important, right? The organization has to be able to manage all of these individuals and even the people they're interacting with. So with things like body cameras, we got into this business because there was a lot of concern about how police were using tasers. And what we saw happening was, people just fall into their sort of intellectual tribe, right? If you like police, nope, the police are fine, there's nothing to see here. If you are in a group that's critical of police, then you would say, no, we can't trust them with anything because cops are always doing something wrong. And neither of those views are correct, right? I mean, the world is nuanced. There's good cops, there's bad cops, there's, we were talking about good cop, bad cop as a thing, right? So I think where body cameras came in, it was, well, let's get out of this philosophical divide about whether you think cops are good or bad. Let's accept that they're all human and they deal with complex situations. And then let's just record what the heck's happening. So at least we can then analyze and understand whether they're doing the right things or not. And then we had the secondary effect, which is probably even more important than what you're talking about here, the observer effect, that when you actually put the camera there, it's not just a passive recording device, it begins to influence behavior, where when people know they're being recorded, the officer who's recording themselves, I've had many officers tell me, hey, this is like a guardian angel on my shoulder. In that moment when I'm tired and I'm frustrated and I might be about to lose my cool, it helps me remember, oh God, I'm recording this. I've got to, I don't get a chance to not be at my best. But they're also reporting that the people they deal with, when somebody realizes they're being recorded, their behavior changes as well, because everybody realizes, all right, I'm not going to be able to hide from whatever I do later. On camera, people behave better, and I think that's an important aspect of this that has been pretty well documented across the board. That these cameras both improve behavior, and then they also help improve organizational performance by giving managers really the ability to truly understand what's happening in a way you just can't get from traditional, text or paper-based business systems where you read a report about what happened. It's like reading about a game in the newspaper versus watching a sporting event on television. You just understand it much more deeply when you can see and hear what's happening versus, just a few words about somebody describing it.
Absolutely. And kind of piggybacking that thought, I'm just curious if you mentioned that secondary effect. Are there any other unintended consequences or surprising feedback that you got from any clients just with regards to any of the technology that you've deployed?
We did see an interesting secondary effect with tasers as well, namely a really high de-escalation rate, particularly in the United Kingdom, because there they track every time you take the taser out of the holster, that is considered a use of force and you've got to write it up. Now, officers don't love that because it means more paperwork, but we get really great data showing about 85% of the time, a taser comes out of the holster, a subject then complies without having to deploy any force. In fact, I remember I've talked to some American police who were initially pretty skeptical in 1999, 2000, when we were first launching the taser. Like any new technology, people were scratching their head. What is this? Why do we need it? I've been doing the job for 20 years with a gun and a baton in my fists. I don't need this thing. Once they started using it, we would get really interesting feedback. I remember one officer who told me how they used it to avoid shooting a 13-year-old girl that was charging them with a knife. She was suicidal. And he said, man, I couldn't imagine. I didn't get in this business to kill 13-year-old girls. I don't know what I would have done had I not had this. But the unintended consequence that we learned about was the deterrent value that, especially among more, let's say, hardened criminals, like people who've had a lot of police interactions, they generally know how the police are going to react. And officers they'd pull a gun on somebody, and an offender would say, "What are you going to do? Shoot me? Come on." You pull a taser out, they know the answer is, well, yeah, I might. It's a much lower threshold where I can use it. I don't, You don't have to be armed with a gun if you're just particularly violent and representing a threat to yourself or someone else. So those behavioral influences across the board, I think, have been the most interesting second order effects.
I think it's interesting. We talk about the data collection aspect is one of the most interesting things to me. And I talk about this a lot on the podcast. I'm a bit of a data nerd. We have a tremendous focus on trying to use data to drive our operations to be more effective, to use data to be more proactive and more preventative in the way we deploy our resources. And I think, you talk about the documentation effect from cameras. Obviously the Taser device itself collects a tremendous amount of data. But when we look at those documentation effects, one of the things I find has been most impactful is we have opportunity to learn from our interactions, right? We can take that firsthand account that the camera provides of the way we handled a situation, good or bad, and learn and grow from that. We have a philosophy called the strategic security officer, where we understand first and foremost that a security officer, public safety officer, whatever you want to call them, in the context of their 12-hour shift out there in the organization, is going to encounter every possible tactical scenario, whether it's helping a little old lady find her way through the hospital to her appointment, or it's dealing with an active threat in the middle of the emergency department who's brandishing a weapon or whatever they're doing. So in the span of all those different interactions, the decisions our officers make have opportunity to present tremendous ramifications for the organizations, both positive and negative. And so our ability to learn from what we do, which we identify as the pursuit of tactical excellence. We want every encounter to be better than the encounter before. Our ability to learn from what we do is incredibly enhanced by the idea of being able to look at those incidents and dissect them in response to, or having that firsthand account from the video. I think that lays a strong foundation for how we de-escalate without ever having to go to any weapon in the future, because we're able to learn and grow.
That is one area we've been investing and partnering with some of our customers on. How do we create feedback loops? Right down to the point, like you said, if we can get officers reviewing their own game tapes, just like pro athletes do. It's always a little socially awkward and uncomfortable to watch yourself, on video. I think nobody likes it, but it just as far as the human experience, right? Because we see things, oh God, I wish I hadn't said that.
That's why we've stuck with the audio format only.
Yeah. But, I think that's how we learn too. I mean, because we are self-critical, just watching yourself go through even not the most critical events, we're going to see things that will improve. Oh, I don't like the way I sounded there. I didn't realize I had that annoying mannerism, or, hey, I guess I did sound a little aggressive the way I was dealing with that person. So I think that those self-feedback loops are a very interesting area for us that we're continuing to kind of iterate and experiment with right now on how to actually implement that into an organization in a sustainable way.
Absolutely. And being someone who lives in Brantford, Ontario, the birthplace of Wayne Gretzky, I'd have to say that was a technique that worked really well from him, was watching those the game tapes. If his dad used to record him practicing and playing, and he was one of the early adopters of that, I guess, of reviewing the game tape. But in terms of the training, Axon has started working on some pretty interesting stuff, some exciting stuff with regards to using virtual reality. Can you share with us about that and how you hope to grow that technology?
Yeah, so in military circles, military spend about 95% of their time training and about 5% on mission. When we look at whether it's public security, public safety, or private safety organizations, the fact is it's flipped. You might get 5% of your time, 10% of your time for training, but 80, 90% plus of time is spent out doing the job. And so anything we can do that can make training more accessible so that it's not, and more effective, right? Like a lot of training today, look, it's sitting in classrooms, going through stuff that might not be all that effective. So VR is a really interesting tech space. We try to keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in different industries. And VR has been found to be really effective in medicine in particular. I think Miami Children's Hospital did some studies on the use of VR in training, physicians or surgeons. And they found that when you experience something, like we know this in general. When you experience something, you remember it, you learn at just a much deeper level than when you read a book about it. And VR gives us a way to create repeatable experiences that are highly immersive. Up until now, VR has been, I'd say, it's still a fairly new technology. In a lot of cases, you had to have a headset and a computer and sensors set up around the room. What's happened in the past 2 years is we've seen the major providers like Oculus and HTC have now launched these all-in-one headsets where you can basically have a VR headset that fits in a small bag that you could take anywhere, put it on, and it has all the sensors you need. You could have a full VR experience without any dedicated facilities. The other piece is to then integrate some of the hardware from the real world. And that's work we're doing right now. So you can have a Glock, you could have a Taser, you could have pepper spray or other tools, so that now we can put you into any of an almost limitless number of scenarios, and then you can actually operate your physical equipment. So we're building the right muscle memory. One simple example is just knowing when to draw your gun versus your Taser. If you're a professional who's carrying both, that's one of these really critical skills that you've got the right one in your hand. And it's one thing to have an instructor stand in front of a group with 50 people and say, okay, everybody, we're going to draw our gun, draw our Taser. It's really kind of hard to keep track of what 50 people are doing. And is somebody really struggling, or are you getting enough reps in? In VR, we can instrument those two devices. And now we can put the headset on, we can put you through 100 reps where draw your gun, draw your Taser, draw your Taser, draw your Taser, draw your gun, back and forth. So you're just getting that muscle memory down, and we can instrument it. So now an instructor could look at a chart of all 50 people and can see, oh, wait a minute, Jones over here is struggling. He's not getting the right rep in, above 95% of the time, or struggling in time to accomplish that task. And then you can do some, remedial training. So we think the VR, both because of its immersion and because it allows us to instrument things that were previously just analog experiences where it'd be two people interacting, doing something, but there's no way to kind of measure the result. The immersiveness and the measurability, I think, are going to lead to just far better training outcomes that we can deploy at a much lower cost over a larger scale of users, and with higher frequency. The idea is you could literally have these headsets. You could have them at home, and you could be every day, or when you begin the shift, you could come in and we could do 10, 15 minutes of training on a daily basis, which really isn't happening. You might get roll call stuff now, but I think it's pretty debatable how effective though it is in terms of actual skill building.
No, I think that's an exciting opportunity, because scenario training is so critical, not only to building kind of the behavioral skills you're talking about, the right weapon at the right time, but just the critical thinking skills and the way we encounter different scenarios. And it creates that safe space that allows people to fail and learn from that experience without the detrimental ramifications of that failure, which is incredibly important to the development of that cognitive skill set in the way that we approach our jobs. I'm excited about that.
Yeah, we're really pumped too. I've never seen in my business career a new technology that's getting adopted as fast and it's with as much excitement as we're seeing with VR, at least for training.
No, that's exciting. The other thing is too, like you said, it really helps simulate the stress that the officer is going to face in those situations when it does happen in real life, which is irreplaceable from a training standpoint. And we know just based on all the studies that your mind doesn't really differentiate an experience like that versus a real experience. So when it does happen in real life, they're going to be that much more prepared for it.
Absolutely. Yep. And you can get more repeatability in training. Like doing scenario training, sort of traditionally has meant you need a place to do it. You need actors. Those actors are wearing safety gear. So it doesn't feel super realistic when you can't really see their facial expressions because they're probably wearing protective helmets and face masks, especially if you're going to be deploying anything like a simunition or a Taser dart. And then just getting it the same every time, they're very hard to do. You can build that scenario in VR and know that every person going through it is facing the same exact, scenario. And you can tune any of the various elements within that scenario in ways you just can't do, in the real world.
I also think, you mentioned, getting it the same every time, the standardization in that process. When you think about large organizations that are trying to put, a couple hundred officers through a training program and ensure similar standards coming out of the other side of that training program, having the ability to deliver a standardized format to each of those officers is critically important. And that's very difficult to do, as you mentioned, in building scenario-based training in the real world, where we have to have those actors who perform a little differently every time. We have all of those caveats to the quote unquote realism of the scenario.
Yep, I agree.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. What can we look forward to from Axon in the future?
Well, we're continually keeping an eye on what new and different technologies are coming down the road that we could leverage into the security space. Our mission is to protect life, and that means pretty much anything we can do that's going to help make it easier for the people whose job it is to keep us safe to do their job and help keep them safer. One of the areas I'm particularly fascinated in right now is drones and robotics. We're partnering with a number of different drone companies. If I take a 10-year look down the horizon, I think another very interesting approach is, I'm not sure it should be a human who's carrying and operating the weapon in these critical incidents. So, if you imagine someone walks into an emergency room and that person is maybe armed and quite dangerous, when we rely on a human operator, basically a security officer, with a gun in their hand or even a taser in their hand, that both draws a threat towards that security professional, right? Because they are now seen as the threat to that subject. And we're asking that individual to make very complex decisions while their brain is frankly impaired. Because at any point, if any one of us is facing a real threat, like a intoxicated person with a gun, our biology reacts. Adrenaline flushes through us, our fine motor skills go out the window, our vision narrows, we get hearing occluded. I mean, we have to train security professionals to the point of muscle memory. The idea is we're basically building reflexes so that they can react reflexively. Oh, I've done this 1,000 times, I'm going to react with a reflex. But if you think about the decision, whether or not you're going to deploy force, and particularly lethal force, the decision whether or not to take a human life, you have to make that decision while your body's working against your brain. That's just a tough position to be in. So I think long-term, and this will be controversial, I think it's going to face a lot of resistance initially, but I think the underlying dynamics, it is actually much better if we have a robotic device that's capable of operating whether it's a taser or any other, weapon, for two reasons. One, it draws the threat vector, if someone's going to respond against that, away from a human. And then second, the person who's operating it, I don't think any of these systems should ever be autonomous. We shouldn't build robots that can make their own decisions. They're going to, use force on us. But I think if it's remotely operated, what we're now doing is we're giving the human operator a little more space, right? I think in the military, it's well accepted. Drone operators can be much more cautious and careful and make better decisions than a guy in a foxhole where there's shells falling around him. So if we can give the security professional the gift of a little distance to where their own personal safety isn't at risk, they're going to be able to make better decisions because, again, they're not fighting their own biology with their own fight or flight response kicking in. So I think that's an area that'll be interesting to watch unfold over the next 10 or 20 years. And that's going to go through this exact cycle we talked about that Taser did early. Initially, people are going to lose their minds and say, oh my God, this is terrible. But then I just ground us back to, well, let's look at the status quo today. Today, we're talking about human beings with lethal weapons and adrenaline surging through their veins. I think we can actually design a technology ecosystem that's safer and better for everybody. We don't live in a world that's perfect now. We've got to accept its limitations and then just incrementally improve on them.
I think I absolutely agree with you that I think drones have tremendous value in the future and the way that we apply them, especially in the private security world. I would just, as you build that ecosystem out, from a branding perspective, you might want to steer away from Skynet as a name.
Actually, I'm going to presage this. We have our big user conference, Accelerate, coming up on November 1st. And there I'm going to be floating our inspiration. It's not Skynet. It's actually Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, back in 1940 coined his 3 laws of robotics. Now, I learned about them from the movie I, Robot with Will Smith. But this idea that if we're going to build drones and robots with more capability, we need to have very crystal clear ethical, moral, and legal guidelines. And so I'm going to be publishing the first draft of Axon's 3 laws of robotics and starting a public conversation. Because I think it's better for us to have those conversations now and agree on what the safeguards are before the technology gets developed and rolled out.
That's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Rick, thank you.
Yeah, it's going to be, it'll be interesting to see how the world reacts. You know, when I wrote my book, The End of Killing, I had a couple controversial concepts in there. And it was a great way to start the conversation to get people thinking about, well, wait a minute, is lethal force always going to be the top dog? Or what would it take for us to get to a world where we no longer need to use lethal force? And then, things like drones and robots, also pretty controversial, but I think it's worth exploring ways. And for goodness sakes, giving the security professionals their safety is important too. I think sometimes that gets lost in the translation. That when you ask people to put their safety on the line, we have an obligation to not put them at undue risk.
Everybody wants to go home safely.
That's right, 100%.
Yeah. Conversely, you know what? If I was to refer to Dave Grossman's book On Killing, it also received some negative feedback as well. So I think whatever killing's in the title, I guess we can expect that the audience is not going to agree on specific outcomes.
Yep, for sure. It's an intense topic, to say the least.
Well, Rick, we're very excited to have had this conversation with you and to be able to share this with other healthcare security professionals. Please do come back anytime if you want to talk more about the implications of your technology or technology in general on protective services within a healthcare environment. I think there's tremendous opportunity for us here, and we're grateful. We're grateful to have you.
Well, it's one of our top areas of focus right now. We've realized as well that the healthcare industry, just given some of the turmoil in the world and some of the social challenges around the various drug epidemics sweeping through the country, it brings a lot of our safety and security and societal challenges into the hospital. And so thanks for the work you guys are doing out on the front line, and to all the listeners out there. I think it's an often overlooked space where some really heroic, men and women protecting some of our most vital resources. And that's, the places we all go in our darkest moments. And when we need to get our lives saved, or our loved ones' lives saved. And those places need to be sanctuaries where there can at least be physical safety on the way in, the way out, and while you're there.
100%. But thanks again, Rick. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We appreciate it. We appreciate you listening. On behalf of myself and Mike, we want to thank you for listening to this episode. We want to wish you a happy holiday season, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Join us again January 15th of 2022. And until then, stay proactive.